The rubble was heavy, heavier than Gideon ever imagined it could be. For the last 8 years he had passed under these great arches every single day, and never once had he stopped to think about just how much shaped rockcrete and faux marble hung above his head. Now, as the mighty bronze doorways to the sovereign domain of the administratum lay bent and broken under the ruin of their frame, he wondered how the terrible weight had been held up at all. He strained and struggled for what could have been hours, shifting brick after brick, slab after slab, cutting his fingers and grazing his arms until at last he saw the muted yellow paneling of the emergency lockers. The scribe forced his weary limbs to dig faster, felt his joints pop as he hauled one last slab of rockcrete to the side, blew away the powdered dust on the bioscan and jammed his thumb onto it. He felt the prick of a needle as the machine drew blood, as if his hands weren't already covered in the stuff. Waited and prayed to the spirit of the machine for a few tense moments, then let out a sigh as the indicator light turned green. The magnetic seals disengaged, and he practically ripped the door off its hinges in his haste to get to the plastic-wrapped treasures within. The emergency rations were rated to last up to 200 years when sealed. These ones had spoiled in their packets, and the bulbs of water, despite being chemically sterile and totally undamaged, had all gone stagnant. He forced them down regardless, eating and drinking until his stomach threatened to turn. The nausea that had been his constant companion for these uncounted days of pain was only made worse, but the gnawing in his gut was at least quietened for the time being. Gathering up the few remaining bars and bulbs for an uncertain future, Gideon scrambled back over the debris in the inner hall and stumbled into the hazy sunlight where Dalian was waiting for him. The world beyond the crumbled arches of Scriptorum Sanctum Delta was as blasted and ruined as any battlefield Gideon had read about. The vista of gilded domes, looming towers, tilted rooftops, turreted steeples, and belching smokestacks that once shaped the horizon in all directions had been reduced to a riot of broken brick and smoking scrap. Constellations of glass twinkled in the light of a sun far too weak for this time of year, and in the depths of open shop fronts and the yawning voids where the faces of buildings should have stood, the darkness seemed to shift with subtle colors. The air stank of rotting food and burning fuel, undertoned with a persistent metallic tang that made Gideon think of copper. At the heart of the square a statue stood, its face a ruined mess of melted bronze. The hands that once held quill and parchment, now severed and lying forgotten on the other side of the road. The wrists twisted and warped, as if they had been torn off and tossed aside by some furious giant. He sat down on the remains of a stone gargoyle that had fallen from high above, offering a stale ration bar to Dalian. She didn't take it. His fellow scribe simply continued to stare vacantly into the distance, her eyes unfocused, keeping her silent vigil. She had been like this since the sky had opened, cold and unresponsive like so many of the others. Rather poor company, Gideon thought, especially considering he had been the one to pull her out from beneath the rubble. But it was what it was, and besides, that did mean more rations for him. The mighty walls of the blessed office block had lost much of their finery in the days of madness. The statues of saints and ranks of protective grotesques now replaced with the stinking remains of scribes dangling from the windows like festivities for Sanguinala. Gideon had hated the work, had felt sick as he strung up his former colleagues, but it had been necessary to keep the bad spirits away. The building's previous guardians had been insufficient to ward off evil, but its new ones seemed to be working just fine. The beasts had not shown themselves for many days now. Gideon's mind wandered unheeded back to that first day of pain, to the day the monster had appeared in their midst and began its bloody rampage. He had been in the privies, lost in the familiar stench of stale waste, the muted sounds of conversation echoing through the thin walls, the cold sting and hiss of the stim injector. He had done it many times before. They all had in his department. No one could be expected to finish a full 18-hour paper shift to the exacting quality demanded by the high scribes without a little chemical help. It was practically sanctioned at that point. The packets distributed discreetly but evenly, arriving on the same day every quarter, in sealed administratum courier boxes marked as militarum surplus. No sense in wasting good supplies when there was still the Emperor's work to do, and there was always more work to do. It was at the precise moment of synthetic rapture, when the cool wave washing over his brain and down his spine clashed with the sensation of warm water rising through his limbs. that he noticed something was wrong. A scream, muffled and impossibly distant in the confines of the privy, broke through the blessed white noise that overcame his senses during the first few seconds after the needle broke his skin. He opened his eyes and lifted his head groggily from the sink, and came face to face with the beast. The black ichor pouring from its mouth, the blood streaking from its nose, a familiar face twisted by a pair of sprouting bovine horns and a grin that split the skin from side to side. Its eyes were the worst. The deep pits of coal that stared into his soul with depthless malice and a sense of humor that went far, far beyond the realms of sanity. His world shifted as the creature twisted its neck around. The muted screaming rose into a piercing shriek, and in his benevolence, the Emperor granted him the gift of unconsciousness. He had no idea how he had survived. A dull plaything, perhaps, easily broken and unworthy of notice from that devil. But when he awoke, he found the building a shattered ruin, his colleagues and friends scattered in parts or missing to some unknown fate. The skies outside had been split by that wound in reality, and the city beneath had fallen into smoking, tremulous chaos. So he had stayed hidden, scavenging from the remains of the offices and trying in vain to call for help on the Vox, but no one answered. After a shade of terror passed through the Scriptorum deep one night and nearly found his hiding spot, some wisdom of unknown providence had compelled him to arrange his colleagues in their glassy-eyed vigil, Darlian their chief at the doorway. That act of desecration had been enough to keep the horrors away, although his sleep had still been terrorized by scenes of carnage. Imagine butcheries in locations across the city that he knew all too well. The markets in the mid-levels reduced to a whirlwind of torn fabric and splayed organs. The precinct fortress a dark tower that poured fire indiscriminately into the baying crowds beyond its walls. The spaceport at Hanya burning in a great conflagration that blocked out the moon. He could still see the smoke today, a dark stain that hid the light of the sun as it sank beyond the western horizon. In every dream he had towered above the madness, watching as creatures of senseless shapes and impossible colors cavorted and lay about themselves in wild abandon. He smelt the fear in the air, tasted the coppery tang of blood as it arced high from open necks, felt it flow hot over his fingers. During his waking hours, when the wind blew across from the inner city, he caught its stink. A clatter in the courtyard brought his mind racing back to the present. Without thinking, he dropped to the ground, heart beating for freedom within his ribs, his lungs burning as they tried to decide between hyperventilating and collapsing entirely. He strained his ears and caught snatches of conversation and careful footsteps somewhere just beyond the broken statue of Gilliman, patron saint of the Administratum. He looked up at Darlian, pressing a shaking finger to his lips, and glanced fearfully over the barricade of rubble. 4 figures stood in the lee of the statue, deep in discussion. One of them consulted a data slate, conversing with 2 others, whilst the last kept glancing furtively back down the road they must have come from. 2 wore the simple clothes of mid-city menials, whilst the one with the data slate was in the uniform of a dock worker, and the nervous one was clad in the torn remnants of PDF fatigues. They all held guns. Gideon froze in place, the weight of hard days and sleepless nights disappearing from his shoulders in a spike of excitement and fear. He dared not flee from the Scriptorum, lest they spot him. What would they do, he wondered, if they knew he was here? Surely they too sought the shelter of the great Scriptorum, wanted to flee the chaos of the streets for the serene silence of his temple to bureaucracy. Even in its ruined state, there would be no safer place in the city, with its deep storage vaults and the rotting guardians keeping watch at its walls. Perhaps they would take him in, share his shelter, and offer him better company than Darlian or the others had done. Perhaps they knew of some way out of the city, some path to salvation where they could leave this madness behind. Perhaps they would help. Or perhaps, an inky voice whispered at the back of his mind, they were just here to take. Perhaps they would make him show them the way to the emergency lockers, force him to break his fingers and tear his palms moving more rubble, then push his hands onto the bioscans and steal the rations for themselves. Perhaps they would drive him away, cast him out of his place of safety and into the demon-infested streets, taking his haven for themselves. Perhaps they would even act kind. lure him into their circle, and ease the secrets of the scriptorium from his lips with honeyed words and a warm embrace, but then shoot him when his usefulness was up. Why shouldn't they? Why should they choose to bear the burden of one more mouth to feed when all around them was already ash? He would not do such a thing, not for a stranger. It would not be efficient. He could not trust them, could not trust anyone save for the dead colleagues he had puppeteered to stand by his side. The fear threatened to overwhelm him like the raging storm that drowns a city in rain. He needed clarity, needed to calm the pounding in his ears and fill the sickening void in his stomach that wanted to swallow him whole. Peace. Peace. By the Emperor, he needed peace. With shaking hands, he withdrew the last of his stim packets, carefully checking the integrity of the needle and the delivery mechanism before plunging it into his wrist. The sting, the hiss, the sensation of lightness and the world-shifting hues and the taste of iron fading from his mouth. The stink of burning promethium and mouldering flesh was overcome by a biting freshness as a cold rush overtook all of his senses. He closed his eyes and allowed himself to slip back behind the rubble, all fear forgotten. The shouting came quickly, but his ears took a long time to inform his brain, and the sluggish thoughts were slow to summon any response. He heard them, the desperate voices of the group in the square, challenging him, warning him. He did not remember rising from his place of rest, nor did he remember descending from the rubble towards where they stood beneath the desecrated statue. His awareness was a curious and distant thing, content to wallow in its cool bath of sensations rather than return to the world of ruin. The bullets came suddenly, their bangs as small and distant as fireworks, their impact little more than a gentle pat on the gut. As his bleary eyes slowly gazed down in curiosity, he saw the gaping hole where his stomach should be, now a torn void that spurted black ichor onto the cobbles. It did not hurt. He did not stop smiling until the work was done. Gideon, the small and petty thing that had been Gideon, was lost far in the back of a mind he had so thoroughly wasted year after dull year, trading places with the thing that had slowly built in his subconscious. Another mind, one born from a distant consensus of reality, which strove for excitement and sensation, and which the little grey man had unwittingly sought to drown in a sea of paperwork and endless, meaningless numbers. He had almost succeeded once or twice, but no matter how hard he tried, the meek little man remained human. He craved sensation, distraction, a life beyond the toil of the cubicles and the maddening repetition of the forms. But all he had was the manufactured nirvana of the needle. It had been the key to keeping his frail body in motion, and it had been enough to leave his mind open. Gideon would return in time as hungry and confused and pathetic as ever, but that was a matter for the future. For now it was this other mind that moved his legs and drove his arms, twisting and gripping and tearing with a strength that did not belong to the scribe. It used Gideon's lungs and lips to laugh with glee, adding his joyful voice to the brutal cacophony until his throat bled. The lost souls did not last long. After a few gleeful moments of hacking and slashing, and nearly an hour of artful posing and the careful ramming of iron pins through joints and into stone, the thing that had been Gideon settled down to admire its work. With a bloody hand it guided the head of Dalian to gaze along with it, and inquired politely if she was happy with her new recruits. She remained wordless. Before the sun was due to set, the great ramparts of Scriptorum Sanctum Delta had 4 new watchmen to keep their glassy gaze over the beautiful ruin of the city, all under the enrapturing lights of the wound in reality that tore the sky in two.